The $325 bottle of Baccarat Rouge 540 sitting on a department store counter and the $32 bottle sitting in a clone company's warehouse were built using the exact same reverse engineering process the fragrance industry prays you never learn about. Designer houses have spent decades convincing you that their formulas are sacred, guarded secrets locked away like state documents. They are not, and they never have been. Perfume formulas cannot be patented. The same handful of factories are quietly building both the $400 original and the $30 clone standing next to it. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why clone fragrances are eating the designer industry alive from the inside. Here is the technique almost no fragrance buyer understands. It is called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and it lets a chemist take a single drop of any perfume on Earth and break it down into its exact molecular components. The machine vaporizes the sample, separates every compound by volatility, and identifies each one by its mass-to-charge ratio. What used to require a genius nose and years of guesswork can now be done in a lab in a matter of hours. A perfumer working for a clone company buys a bottle of the designer fragrance, runs it through the machine, and receives a printout that reads almost like a recipe. It shows which aroma molecules are present and in roughly what proportion. From there, a trained nose rebuilds the formula using the same or chemically similar ingredients. And after several rounds of blending and testing, the result sits close enough to the original that most people cannot tell the difference in a blind test. This is not some shady back alley operation, and it is worth separating it clearly from actual counterfeiting, because the two get lumped together constantly, and they are not the same thing at all. A counterfeit perfume copies the brand name, the bottle shape, the label, and the box, and sells itself as the genuine article to trick a buyer into thinking they got the real thing at a discount. That is fraud. It is illegal everywhere, and it is genuinely dangerous, since counterfeit operations have no obligation to follow any safety regulation and have been caught using contaminated or outright toxic ingredients. A clone or an impression fragrance does the opposite. It never claims to be the original. It uses its own name, its own bottle, and its own packaging. And it openly states which designer scent it was built to resemble. One is theft dressed up as commerce. The other is a legal business model built on a gap in intellectual property law that has existed since the earliest days of modern perfumery, and treating them as the same phenomenon is exactly the confusion the designer industry benefits from. This is standard operating procedure across an entire segment of the fragrance industry. And it works because of a legal loophole the designer houses cannot close no matter how many lawyers they hire. A perfume formula is not protected the way a song or a logo is protected. You cannot patent a smell in any meaningful commercial sense, and you cannot trademark the way a fragrance evolves on someone's skin over 8 hours. What the law protects is the bottle design, the box, the label, and the brand name. That is why every clone company on the market uses careful language. They never say their product is Baccarat Rouge 540. They say it is inspired by, or an impression of, or their interpretation of a scent you would recognize instantly if you smelled the real thing standing next to it. That phrasing is not a marketing trick. It is the entire legal foundation the clone industry is built on, and it has held up because there is nothing else for the designer houses to sue over. Take Baccarat Rouge 540 itself, launched by Maison Francis Kurkdjian, and turned into arguably the most cloned fragrance of the last decade. A 2.4-ounce bottle now runs between $325 and $410, depending on where you buy it. A brand called Dossier, which formulates its fragrances in Grasse, France, the same region that has trained perfumers for centuries, sells its interpretation called Ambery Saffron for around $32 in a comparable 50-milliliter bottle. All the fragrances are tagged in this video with the best prices I could find. If any of these are on your radar, the link is already there. Now here is where the story stops being about clever chemists in a lab and starts being about something the designer industry genuinely does not want you thinking about too hard. Most people assume that when they buy a bottle with Gucci or Calvin Klein or Burberry printed on the front, the fashion house itself designed, formulated, and manufactured that fragrance from scratch, the same way it might design a handbag. That is almost never true. The overwhelming majority of designer fragrances are made under licensing agreements, where the fashion brand rents out its name to a completely separate fragrance company in exchange for an upfront fee and ongoing royalties. Coty, one of the largest players in the industry, holds the fragrance licenses for Calvin Klein, Gucci, Hugo Boss, Chloe, Burberry, Marc Jacobs, Tiffany & Co., and Prada's Miu Miu line, among others. Puig, a Spanish conglomerate, owns the fragrance rights outright for Paco Rabanne, Jean-Paul Gaultier, and Carolina Herrera, and holds licenses that have moved between houses like Valentino and Prada over the years, depending on who wins the bidding war. Interparfums controls the fragrance side of brands like Lacoste, Mont Blanc, and Guess. These licensing deals get renegotiated and traded constantly, sometimes moving a brand's entire fragrance line from one manufacturer to a competitor overnight. Prada spent years with its fragrance license held by Puig, then ended the relationship, and the industry immediately began speculating about whether L'Oréal or Coty would win the next contract. Valentino's fragrance license moved from Puig's to L'Oréal in a similar shakeup, with L'Oréal openly stating its ambition to become the leading player in prestige perfume through exactly this kind of acquisition. Burberry once bought its own fragrance business back from Interparfums at significant cost, only to sell the entire operation to Coty a few years later and destroy millions of dollars worth of unsold stock in the process. A fashion house can lose its own perfume business the same way a landlord loses a tenant, because the name on the bottle was never the same thing as the hand that built what is inside it, and the identity of that hand can change every few years, depending entirely on who wins a licensing negotiation you never hear about. And it goes one layer deeper than that. Even the companies holding these licenses, the Cotys and Puigs of the world, rarely create the actual scent formula in-house. That job belongs to an even smaller, even less visible group of companies that most consumers have never heard of. They are called the fragrance and flavor houses, and there are really only a handful of them that matter: Givaudan, Firmenich, IFF, Simrise, Robertet, and Mayne. These companies employ the actual perfumers, the noses, who compose the fragrances that get slapped with 100 different brand names. A single perfumer working inside one of these giant fragrance houses might create a best-selling scent for a mass designer brand and, in the same year, create a supposedly exclusive niche scent for a completely different label, marketed as artisanal and rare. Quentin Bisch, one of the leading noses at Givaudan, has this exact resume. He built Good Girl, one of Carolina Herrera's biggest sellers. He built Delina for Parfums de Marly. He built Nomade for Chloe. Different brands, different bottles, different marketing stories about heritage and craftsmanship. And the same chemist working out of the same building using the same library of raw materials. Creed's Aventus, one of the most famous and most cloned masculine fragrances of the modern era, was formulated by IFF. Byredo's Angel's Share and Herod both trace back to Givaudan. Maison Margiela's By the Fireplace came out of Firmenich. Niche fragrance, in other words, is frequently not the intimate handcrafted alternative to designer perfume that its marketing implies. It is the same handful of industrial fragrance conglomerates wearing a different, more expensive costume. And the story about a solitary artisan hunched over a workbench in a quiet atelier is usually closer to fiction than to how the bottle actually got made. Understanding this changes how the entire designer versus niche versus clone conversation should be framed. The traditional hierarchy places designer fragrance in the middle, niche fragrance above it as the exclusive artistic tier, and clone fragrance below both as the cheap imitation unworthy of serious consideration. But if a Givaudan perfumer is building bestsellers for a mass designer brand and a supposedly rarefied niche label in the same calendar year using the same aromachemal library, the gap between designer and niche was never as wide as the price tag suggested. And if a clone company can reverse engineer either tier using the exact same GCMS process, because neither tier was ever protected by anything more than trademark law, then the entire hierarchy starts to look less like a ladder of craftsmanship and more like a ladder of marketing budgets stacked on top of one another. This is the part of the story clone companies have quietly figured out how to exploit. If the fragrance and flavor houses are already recycling techniques, aroma chemicals, and even entire structural formulas across dozens of client brands, then the idea that any single designer scent is a singular, untouchable creative achievement starts to fall apart. A clone company does not need to break into Givaudan's laboratory to figure out what is inside a best-selling perfume. It only needs a GCMS machine and a bottle purchased at retail, because the raw materials being used were never exotic secrets to begin with. Most of what goes into a modern designer fragrance is built from a rotating cast of synthetic aroma molecules that the big fragrance houses sell to anyone willing to pay, sometimes even to each other. Ambroxan and its branded cousins, Amberfix from Givaudan, Ambrox Super from Firmenich, Ambermore from IFF, all do roughly the same olfactory job and all show up across dozens of unrelated fragrances from dozens of unrelated brands. The idea of a totally proprietary designer scent, one that could never plausibly be reconstructed, is largely a fiction the industry has been comfortable letting you believe. So if the actual liquid inside the bottle is not the untouchable part of the equation, what exactly are you paying for when you drop $300 or $400 on a designer fragrance? The numbers here are not disputed inside the industry. They are openly discussed by perfume executives themselves. Across the mass luxury fragrance segment, the actual fragrance oil and alcohol inside the bottle typically accounts for somewhere between 1 and 10% of the retail price, with 3% being the figure cited most consistently by people who work inside fragrance manufacturing. On a $150 bottle, that means the scent itself might represent $4 or $5 of actual cost. The rest, somewhere between 80 and 90% of what you hand over at the counter, goes toward packaging, advertising campaigns, celebrity endorsement deals, retail distribution, and profit margins stacked on top of profit margins. Department stores routinely apply markups in the range of 45 to 100% on top of what they pay the manufacturer. A single full-page advertisement in a major fashion magazine can cost more than $30,000. And that expense gets baked into the price of every bottle sold that quarter. None of this is a conspiracy theory. It is how the business has operated for decades, and it is the exact structure that makes cloning so financially devastating to compete against.